And I'll let you know once we're live.
Do we know how many people are coming?
Anyone who's interested.
It can be millions and millions, as I said earlier.
Yes, that's what I think too.
And if you could please mute your microphones when you're not speaking, that would make the sound better. All right. Or what is it? Modern Warfare. That's the title. New one. Modern Warfare. Okay. We're going live.
Okay. Welcome to Free World Connect. My name is Gunnar Hökmark. I'm chairman of the Stockholm Free World Forum. And we are trying to discuss and get together people under the framework of Free World Connect in a time when that is very needed. And today our theme is Modern Warfare. We are launching a book that is a result of a conference, a transatlantic conference, with people from both sides of the Atlantic having discussed the threats to freedom and democracy. You're very welcome, and the executive director of Free World Forum, Katarina, Tracz, will introduce the discussion and the speakers. They belong all to the very best in their kind.
Definitely. Thank you, Gunnar, and thank you for watching Free World Connect, our program series during a time when we cannot meet physically. Today we are launching a book called Modern Warfare, New Technologies and Enduring Concepts. And this book is a result of a conference called the Transatlantic Leadership Forum that we hosted this fall with help from the US Embassy here in Stockholm. And this conference brought together a group of speakers from various countries on both sides of the Atlantic to discuss the threats of today and the challenges of tomorrow on both sides of the Atlantic and how we will try to face them together. So for this purpose, we have published an excellent book. And with us here today, we have a group of speakers who will introduce their various takes on the issue. We have Oscar Jonsson, who is the editor of the book, who's also the academic director of IE in Madrid since recently. We also have Michel Kofman, who is the director and senior research scientist at CNA Corporation in Washington. We have Michel, who is a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council Brent Statecraft Center on International Security in Washington. Aurore Belfrage, who is with us from Stockholm today, a tech entrepreneur, a political advisor and investor, and also Patrik Oksanen, who is a senior fellow with us at Stockholm Free World Forum, and as of last week, also a member of the Swedish Royal Academy of War Sciences. So welcome to all of you. I will not say much more, but I will hand over the word directly to Oscar Jonsson, who will tell us a bit more about the take of the book. So please, Oscar.
Great, thank you very much, Katarina, and thank you all for joining. So I start this book by a quote and a question, and I think the quote is Clausewitz, as you may know, who says the most supreme act of the statesman and commander is to decide what war we are embarking on. And this question I ask is, if a strategist has 10 billion to spend to achieve maximal influence of an adversary, what would you spend it on today? And I think the answer is not that clear-cut. I get a lot of different responses, from hackers to nukes to troll factories to hypersonic cruise missiles, for instance. And I think that question really underlines the dilemma facing modern strategies today. And it goes to the heart of how war and conflict is changing. And a lot of the things that people would answer to that question are also things that will fall outside the traditional military domain. At the same time, the key parts of war and conflict remains. War as a battle of wills, deterrence, for instance, which we'll talk more of, and therefore the subtitle of the book, which is New Technologies and Enduring Concepts. What I'm trying to do in my chapter is really to show which are the way modern statecraft is changing. And only part of that comes from pioneering military technology, but a lot of that comes from changes in society, changes the way we live, we access information, the way we generate value. So to understand, for instance, Russia's most notable offensive actions, you need to understand the revolution in information communication technology. Today, when we form our understandings and perceptions of legitimacy and what's happening in the world on social media platforms, well, of course, Russian strategists are going to think about that and think about how to be effective of that. We have a globalization of finance that increases vastly the opportunities for illicit finance. And this book also looking more towards tomorrow. We have one chapter on geopolitical consequences of AI, one chapter on how to mitigate the impact on international security from emerging technologies. So the key point that I'm trying to get across really is that we need to update our understandings of modern conflict according to our societies and economies are changing without losing sight for the need for military, non-military deterrence, the use of coercive bargaining, etc. So this is really the rationale, and that's why for the book we brought together everything from Russia experts to former treasury officials who are expert on finance, to AI entrepreneurs, as you will hear, Aurore, to journalists and to scholars. So I hope that is good, interesting enough as a teaser for the book, and I'm happy to hand the word over to Mike.
Hi, thanks. Really appreciate it. I'll try to be brief here, and I'm going to break up my talk into two sections: the strategic challenge from Russia as we see it, and then military stuff. And I'm just going to try to make some cogent points there. On a strategic challenge, basically, I hope you can hear me okay. On a strategic challenge, basically, I outline it sort of focusing cogently into three main points. One, Russian leadership has determined that they have no stake in Europe's, the continent's current security architecture, right? And they have sufficiently restored Russian power to challenge what was established during a time of Russian weakness. While Russia may not offer a suitable alternative beyond a retrograde sort of great power division, spheres of influence, it is unwilling to accept that which has been built before. The second problem stems from ongoing fragmentation of Russian influence and what constitutes the former Soviet space and Moscow's fight to arrest its decline. Right? And this basically the endless challenge of a great power losing its empire, then fighting to regain what it had lost over some time period before running out of power and juice. This happened to Britain, it happened to France, it happened to others. The only problem in the Russian case is that Russia did not run out of military power and capacity within 10, 15, 20 years like Britain and France did. It actually was able to regenerate and restore a substantial amount of military power within one generation. This is the first time it happened. It also happened between 1922 and 1939. So history can repeat itself. Okay, so the EU has emerged as a leading but not a very thoughtful or deliberate competitor in what Russian leadership considers its privileged sphere of influence, the former Soviet space. It's economically very attractive and politically it's very attractive, right? And it's important to understand the USSR was dissolved in December 1991, but Russia's still in the throes of imperial collapse, a process playing out over decades. So recent conflicts should really be viewed as de facto wars of succession of what is still a collapsing Russian empire. Because even if you choose to do nothing about the Russian problem set, understand that this is unfolding and you have to react to crises and wars as the result of the still fragmentation of Russian influence. Third problem was born of Russian strategy, both to attain security for itself and to compel the United States to accept a new settlement, a new détente. In Europe, Russia claims to extended defense, which is premised on buffer states, which implicitly requires Moscow to limit the sovereignty of its neighbors and influence their strategic orientation. Extended defense has been an enduring Russian strategy in contemporary history. Russia's ability to execute without the conventional military power is questionable, given the decline of its political economic influence. Sorry, I apologize if there's background noise here that you can hear. No, it's good, great. And then moving on very briefly to military stuff, which is kind of the other focus of my chapter, which is fundamentally, it focuses more on direct warfare than direct, but military's organized warfare is about hurting people and breaking things. And the main points I'll make quite briefly is one, on how we should think about the Russian problem set and how we should think about NATO vis-a-vis Russia. In abstract, NATO may appear superior when glancing at tables of forces, but as I often tell my junior military analysts, Excel spreadsheets don't fight, okay? What's on paper doesn't matter. in a sustained conflict is unlikely between pure nuclear powers anyway, so planning to win a long war on the basis of economic or manpower superiority is a luxury that NATO simply doesn't have. European history actually is replete with demonstrations of how great powers with superior manpower and economic strength can be defeated in continental Europe in just a matter of weeks. For example, see French and British military performance between May and June of 1940, okay? What matters really is the percentage of forces that can be deployed or encountered within an operationally meaningful time. We measure military power in context, not in the abstract, right? We don't do a hypothetical battle between Russia and NATO on Mars. Some forces are useful for deterrence, but others are better as a hedge in a warfighting scenario. And important to drive home to people, warfighting and deterrence are not the same. They're not the same capabilities. Most military people say deterrence when they mean warfighting and defense, because they just use an excuse to buy whatever it is they want to buy and argue for whatever forces they want to argue. But deterrence is a strategy of limited means aimed at a tailor to a particular adversary, whereas buying military stuff to fight wars is just that. We overemphasize ground forces for deterrence, but the initial period of war, from a Russian perspective, from a modern war perspective, is determined by the matchup between airspace attack and airspace defense, all right? Last 2 points here, and I will close out because I apologize, I don't know if I've overrun my 4 minutes. Too much attention has been given to Russian A2AD capabilities, which don't represent the strategy or doctrine in the Russian armed forces. There's no such term in Russia. It's not a Russian operational concept. You can thank America's China Watcher community for this terminology. This creates a misperception that military technology lends itself to favor defensive strategy. That is not the Russian interpretation. That is not why Russians bought all these things. A defensive strategy, or perhaps an offensive followed by an area defense, is mostly born of Western mirror imaging. It's basically trying to portray Russia as the Egyptian military of 1973. But it's not Russian military doctrine nor operational concepts, because Russian military doctrine is principally offensive and preemptive, and it usually has classified defense as being cost prohibitive, right? Which is the best defense is an active defense, and the best move is the first move, you strike first. And many of these strategic operations are offensive in nature rather than just defensive, because defense is not operationally all that viable in many cases against US airspace power. And the last comment, far too much analysis, particularly in this region, and by region I mean the Nordic countries and the Baltics, naturally focuses too much on Kaliningrad, and too many people trying to work out what the war of NATO versus Kaliningrad, or even Sweden versus Kaliningrad looks like. And my answer to that calculation is, who cares? Kaliningrad's not a country. It's a tiny grouping of Russian military forces. That's not the problem set. When we think about dealing with Russia, we think on a minimum of regional war scale, okay? We think about a fairly sizable conventional high-end capabilities and operations. We don't think about one grouping of Russian forces in one confined geographic territory. All right, thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mike. You managed to squeeze in most in your chapter in a brief time, so thank you for that. We will move on in the sort of traditional threats part of the book, and I will give the floor to Leo Michel. Leo, please.
There we are. Good morning. My chapter deals with modern deterrence, the challenges of how modern deterrence differs somewhat from deterrence as we knew it during the Cold War, and also on Swedish interests. But rather than actually summarize my chapter, what I thought it might be useful to do would be to provide brief updates on 4 of the key issues that my paper, which was published in November, treats. So these are things that have happened since November, but brings us up more or less to the current day. The first, there's been no discernible progress in US efforts to negotiate the denuclearization of North Korea. Indeed, North Korea conducts periodic tests of its short-range ballistic missiles, and according to a recent UN report, continues to maintain and construct nuclear facilities. Kim Jong-un said in December, that's 1 month after my paper was published, that he no longer felt bound by his self-imposed moratorium on nuclear weapon and long-range missile testing. So North Korea remains a hotspot and potentially one of the worst flashpoints for a conflict. Second, tensions remain high between Iran and the West and in particular, the United States. In January, the US and Iran came dangerously close to a full-fledged military confrontation following the US targeted killing of General Soleimani. And according to the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog agency, Iran's growing stockpile of nuclear fuel recently crossed a critical threshold. Specifically, for the first time since President Trump withdrew almost 2 years ago the US from the 2015 multilateral nuclear deal, known as the JCPOA, Tehran appears to have enough enriched uranium to produce a single nuclear weapon, though it would take additional months or years to manufacture a warhead and deliver it over long distances. Third, the fate of the New START Treaty, which is the last remaining US-Russian agreement limiting nuclear weapons and delivery systems, remains uncertain. As recently as yesterday, Russian officials restated their willingness to extend the New START Treaty, which expires in February 2021, for another 5 years, something which is permitted by the treaty. However, in an interview earlier this month, President Trump's newly appointed arms control envoy strongly criticized the New START Treaty and indicated that the administration was unlikely to extend it unless China agreed to join multilateral nuclear negotiations, a move that Chinese officials have repeatedly dismissed out of hand. Fourth, we should note recent developments regarding nuclear weapons issues affecting NATO. First, the German Defense Ministry last month announced its intention to purchase, beginning in 2022, some 30 US-made F-18 dual-capable aircraft. These are aircraft capable of conducting nuclear as well as conventional missions. If approved by the Bundestag, this would allow Germany to continue its full participation in NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements. Personally, I view this as a very positive development, although one can still anticipate between now and then a very hot political debate in Germany over this question. On the other hand, last Friday, the US ambassador to Poland, a Trump political appointee, tweeted the suggestion that US nuclear weapons, and there were reportedly 20 gravity bombs, nuclear bombs based in Germany, could be relocated to Poland. Once again, in my personal view, this is a shockingly bad idea for many reasons, which we can discuss later if you would like. My final point is that many of you are aware that in November, this coming November, we will hold our presidential and congressional elections. I believe that nuclear weapons issues and deterrence are unlikely to figure prominently in the campaign or in voters' decisions. They will be overshadowed by a number of things, obviously including the administration's handling of the COVID crisis. But prominent experts and former officials in previous Democratic and GOP administrations, including myself, are worried that about a breakdown of what used to be a broad general consensus in the US that favored arms control as a vital complement to defense programs and deterrence to advance US national security interests. I'm concerned about the breakdown or the weakening of this consensus, and it's something that we may see play out during the campaign and its aftermath. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo, for providing that perspective on an issue that is a lot of times discussed here in Sweden. The nuclear issue is rather sensitive, hasn't been discussed much lately, but previously so. We will move on to the part of the book that focuses more on contemporary and future threat images. And for this reason, I would like to give the word to Aurore to explain your chapter and your take on modern threats and future ones as well.
Thank you. Yes, an honor to be here, and very glad to have contributed to the book. So the chapter I wrote was about AI and warfare. and AI as the defining geopolitical factor of our time. Because AI and artificial intelligence is changing all facets of society, and sometimes at exponential speed, which is a tricky concept to intuitively understand. And my work takes a holistic approach to the societal impact of artificial intelligence. So looking at more of the underlying factors, the fundamentals that are influencing the geopolitical power shift, if you want. So not specifically warfare or defense, but more the economy, healthcare, infrastructure, where artificial intelligence is used as a force to strengthen, and because of its exponential power, will catapult nations and companies to have a profound impact on a country's ability to waver war or peace. So one of the key points to understand in this AI geopolitical analysis is that we need to broaden our understanding of the stakeholders in this geopolitical power struggle. Not only should you consider and map nations' activities, but also, as I argue in my book, the big tech companies that just by their sheer size, tech ability, ownership of data, can and do influence the political decisions of our time. The surveillance discussion around COVID-19 is a great example of where Google and Apple have joined forces and changed, for example, how Germany will approach its citizens' mapping and monitoring. So my chapter in the book covers some of the factors influencing AI development in general. The first being capital, which is an obvious one, a country's ability to invest in technology and entrepreneurs. And we've all seen the headlines, which tend to be bombastic, big numbers that are being invested. My point is, though, that capital is a commodity and it's not enough on its own. And another thing to remember is, which is sometimes forgotten, is to analyze and map who the funds are, state-owned or private. SoftBank's Vision Fund or EU's European Investment Bank are huge players that behind the scenes are influencing how capital is flowing and thereby setting the political agenda by allowing certain technologies to live or die. So the only way to understand how the shifts are moving is knowing who owns the capital and money and their political agenda, either if it's private or national. Another obvious factor to look at is talent. So developing and attracting talent is a long-term play, but absolutely fundamental to any nation who's looking to be a superpower. A handful of companies and governments are systematically hoovering the market for tech talent and paying abysmal prices for them, and thereby dominating the global output for relevant AI. So it's easy to forget that you need the brain power in order to be a superpower, and a few companies and nations are in the lead there by having a very ambitious strategy, but also putting money behind it. And this could have long-term democratic consequences. The second obvious layer to that, if you have a long-term perspective on being a superpower within the AI domain, is rethinking your educational system, because that will have a huge impact on the number and the quality. So it's both the quantitative and the qualitative measure of your ability to shift the geopolitical power in your favor. Another thing that we all know is data. So access to data is the fuel of the AI economy. And as I mentioned earlier, ownership of structured, usable data about everything possibly that you can imagine is a huge factor here. And the key players are not necessarily nation states. The key players are the big tech companies. And here's another factor which is influencing the geopolitical shift that one needs to be aware of, and that's tax. And why is tax an interesting factor? The reason is that AI will most likely have a fundamental shift in our labor markets and have a catalyzing effect on the current trend of wealth concentration, making it potentially harder for working in middle classes. Thus, we might need to rethink allocation of capital to our citizens. Some would call it universal basic income. However, you could only reallocate what you have. Therefore, many predict that the host nations of the successful tech companies that are able to charge tax revenues properly will have the financial buffer to take care of their citizens if they choose to do so. Because it's the social unrest and the social inequalities that potentially will be catalyzed by artificial intelligence will fundamentally change societies and therefore have an impact on the geopolitical power structure. So my main point in the article, except highlighting how the shift is built, is that AI is not only about the technology in itself. It's a moral, social, security, and practical considerations that need to be made. Additionally, I would argue that we need a sense of urgency. And I'm talking from a European perspective here. If we are to remain in the game in Europe and the EU, governments and AI talent need to work together to improve diagnosis in healthcare, fight terrorism, work towards infrastructure, share data, share talent, and improve our educational system in order to have a fighting chance to play in this game. And Europe needs to wake up to the fact that AI is redrawing the political map, and we need to rethink many of the aspects of our society to keep up. Thank you.
Thank you, Aurore. This topic has become even more relevant the past few months due to the COVID-19 crisis, and I look forward to ask some questions in the end of this panel about that. But before I do so, I would like to handle the floor to Patrik Oksanen, who will talk about another aspect of modern warfare that is has gained some attraction, not the least in Finland and Sweden lately. Patrik, please.
Thank you. My chapter is about the hybrid threat issue that could be potentially very important in the eve of war, but even before wartime, there are benefits from an actor handling this. And it's about real estate, to invest in real estate. And we have had, from Russia, we know that it's been money laundering in huge amounts, and some of this money have gone to real estates in Sweden and Finland, and real estates close to strategic areas. In Finland, it was noted first, and it was around sea lanes, transportation hubs, important bases, and so on. And in Sweden, there is one case that has been very much noticed, and it was building of a Moscow Patriarch Church very close to the strategic Västerås airport. And in both these cases, there are a lot of cases from Finland and the Swedish case, you see money laundering as one part of it and the geographic of it, and one could call it a multi-purpose money laundering idea. If you just have it as real estate, you have the value of the real estate, but then in a subversion, you can add more values into it. You could use it as safe house, you could use it as intelligence gathering platforms, or a base in event of war, where you could place your small green men and then have that as a base when they go out and do mischiefs in the beginning of the war, before perhaps we understand it is a war. In Sweden, the Swedish security police has stated that they have noticed that Russia is building platforms in Sweden, intelligence gathering platforms. That is a quote from their press conference last year. And the reaction in Finland has been that Finland has started to do new legislation, and in order to make it harder for non-EU citizens to buy these kinds of real estate around the country. And in Sweden, we have also seen a debate and ongoing investigation how to change the Swedish legislation in order to protect strategic assets that could be of interest. These issues are pretty hard for us to grasp, that comes from a peaceful mindset in a society where we have wanted to have a free market, open borders, and trade and buy and so on. So this means that we need to change our psychological idea of how to view these kinds of threats. And that is why it has been taking several years before it has come up to the political agenda, but we are there now. So that is what my chapter is talking about, with examples and also some conclusions on what's going on and what's needed to be done.
Thank you, Patrik. And I think we will have more reason to discuss this, not only with regards to Russia, but also with China. This morning here, the news was that the Chinese state is now a significant shareholder in Norwegian Airlines. So other strategic assets than just real estate are affected by these problems. I want to thank all the speakers for their introduction and hand over the word to the editor, Oscar Jonsson, for some comments, reflections, and questions before opening up the floor.
Well, thank you, Katarina. I think there's reflections, there's too many to even try to fit them in, but I just want to kind of, first of all, reinforce what Aurore said about something that Josh has brought up in his chapter on illicit finance. And he didn't say it in this way, but the idea was basically, in certain areas, we have absolutely no clue who's owning what and which money goes where. And this is a problem. So I want to ask all the speakers, I mean, the theme of the book is modern warfare. And I will not put you on the spot and say, what would you spend those 10 billions on for maximum influence? But I wanted to ask, so in Sweden, we're in the final stages of taking a new defense bill for the coming 5 years. And my take, which I've stated elsewhere, is that we're looking at yesterday's threats and trying to put together yesterday's solutions. But I wanted to ask all of you, kind of loosely interpreted, what do you consider the largest mismatch by the way you understand conflict today and what we are de facto doing and preparing for today? So, in another way of saying, what are you most worried about? And go ahead, anyone who wants to shoot first.
That will be hard because everyone will unmute at the same time. But I guess that I will give the first Aurore the first opportunity to answer that, and then you others can sort of raise your hands, and we'll take it in order.
Thank you, Katarina. It's an interesting question, and it's obviously hard to answer with any dead certainty. But I think one of the interesting points is what is surrounding us in terms of societal volatility. Where are we in a situation where demographics, climate change, social inequality, other factors that are influencing our security, that are sometimes seen as completely different sectors to be analyzed. So we're not properly creating the overlap in terms of thinking where these other subsectors are given the depth that they have from a security point of view. It's just quite recently that we started to see climate change as a security challenge, for example, in the Security Council. So I would say it's to have a more holistic approach, but also, as I was saying, a sense of urgency when it comes to the knowledge gap and the investment gap that we are seeing in Europe, both in terms of artificial intelligence, but something that I didn't mention in the chapter, but which is of the same significance, is quantum computing. So again, like having the ability to look, what's the next chapter and how are we prepared?
All right, thank you. I saw Leo raising his hand, so please.
General Stanley McChrystal who's now been retired for several years, an Army general, was the head of U.S. Special Forces for a long period of time, a NATO commander as well in Afghanistan. And after his retirement, when he was asked what he would have done, in retrospect, what he would have done differently after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States, from a defense military point of view, he said, in retrospect, his first step would have been to send 10,000 US soldiers to language school. Because, of course, we found out through many years, more than a decade of counterinsurgency warfare, that the US really couldn't be effective for several reasons, but one was the inability really to understand the strategic and operational environment that we were in at the time. You ask a very good question, Oscar, but it's very difficult today to point to kind of a single answer the way General McChrystal did a number of years ago. And I think Aurore, she mentioned whole of government. It goes actually beyond just government agencies working together, which is very important, but to understand the intersection of military with economics, with environment and all of that. It almost comes down, and I think we're seeing it now in the COVID crisis, a societal question of how governments are organized with their publics to think about long-term. In our democracies, and this is true in the United States, it's true in other democracies, we talk a lot about strategy, but in many ways we're not very good at it because strategy is almost by definition long-term. We have to think beyond the 2 or 4 years of a particular, or 5 years in some cases, of a particular official in office. And I have to say, this is not so much a money question, but perhaps a more kind of political social question, is how do we maintain the basis of consensus? I'm thinking in democratic societies, at least, where we can reach a middle ground and think on the basis of facts, not on the basis of opinions or conspiracy theories, with our strategy of defense, of deterrence, integrated now in these other areas, looking at the environment, looking at health security, the impact of artificial intelligence over many years. And this is a difficult task because I think we've grown too comfortable in the old ways of thinking. That's why our new generation has a large challenge ahead of them.
Thank you, Leo. Mike, with regards to the threat from Russia, do you think we're focusing on the right issues?
No, because we're not focusing generally. I mean, if you look at how NATO, Europeans, the United States talk about Russia, they talk about all the problems, and they don't talk about which ones that matter. I try to actually focus on what the 3 main challenges I really thought could be constituted strategic challenges, right? In US, we often tend to practice strategic sophistry, where we just put the word strategic in front of anything, then we make a list of things we either want to do or things the other side is doing that we don't like, and there's no coherency to them, there's no prioritization. Strategy is about choices. And it's about a theory that links means to ends. I'd say what kind of concerns me, to me, how we get to the answers that are most vexing about great power contests, great power wars, and the problem with Russia is, first, on the military side, simply put, we've had a great power interregnum for over 70 years. So most military people really struggle fundamentally trying to envision what the next great power war looks like or how you would deter it. There is always a natural tendency to fight the last war, but there's a big problem when the last war happened so long ago that generally you're looking to other smaller conflicts to learn lessons and generalize from them, many of which actually don't tell you what you need to know necessarily, right? Your fight in Syria, your fight in Afghanistan, Russia's intervention in Syria tells you some useful things, but they are not things that can be all ported over to Europe and how we think about deterring in Russia and Europe necessarily. The big challenge, at least we have, this is speaking now as an American, obviously from Washington, D.C. For United States, our challenge is that great power war and great power contests and sustained competition in this century is fundamentally still a cognitive gap. It is a gap of strategy, and we are very much technology fetishist, capability-focused culture. That is, we believe much more in programmatic strategy than strategy, and we like to buy stuff and put it places. And so even when we talk about, from a defense perspective, when we talk about things like AI, what Aurore was talking about, AI in most military circles is like magic. There'll be a ship, and then we're going to duct tape AI to it, and it'll be much better at what it does, and that's what AI is going to do, right? It sounds like voodoo magic generally, but most of the thinking about what is AI going to do for modern warfare, well, it'll be just like warfare was before, plus AI, and AI is going to make it better. And that's about, this is it. This is kind of a construct. And so because of that, we should buy as much AI as we can, because AI is going to make things better. All right. And what I'm getting to is that we tend to think much more about capabilities and technology. We tend to think a lot less about strategy, operational concepts, and Europeans tend to import way too much of our thinking for lack of their own strategic thinking all the time. At least that's my own perception. I'm not a Europeanist. Leo may disagree with me. He and I worked together for a long time. He knows Europe much better. But this is my impression. And if you import American thinking, it's going to get very expensive very fast. So my sense of it is that the challenge we have to address is, one, those big vexing question about what great power world looks like today. The second one is about what great power contest looks like today. What is the ultimate strategic contest between the United States, between Europe and Russia? I tried to frame it a bit, but this is still very much a challenging question for the United States. The United States generally just has a shopping list of things that it would like Russia to stop doing. This is it. And for a long time, people have told me in DC that our Russia strategy, it's incipient. And it's been incipient for a very long time, for all of those years. So we haven't gotten there, we haven't found. And then big picture is always a question pertaining to Oscar's recent work. Was the relationship between direct and indirect warfare and indirect competition between states? This century is different from the last one. In the US, obviously, we see these contests in reference to the Cold War. And when we say the Cold War, we don't really mean the Cold War, we mean the Second Cold War. And by that, typically people only thinking about 1980 to about 1988 at best. But there are things that you could do with indirect means today, information warfare, political warfare, that were really nuisances during the Cold War, but are much more significant today. And I think we're still exploring that, particularly in our interactions with Russia. They're much more significant than they were during the latter half of the 20th century. That is, there's nothing new there in terms of activity, but there's a lot of innovation. There are big differences in impact and how countries react to it. And that to me is very interesting and profound. It certainly really captured a lot of the strategic zeitgeist in the United States, particularly because as a strategic culture, the US is very used to being largely invulnerable and not having another country be able to reach out and touch it. And it reacts very viscerally in the few cases in history when that's happened, because we are not in a European landmass, we are not in Asia or Eurasia, we're not surrounded by countries realistically or threats. We're very unused to a country being able to reach out and actually touch us via indirect means and threaten us in that way. Okay, sorry, that was a bit of a run-on, but I apologize to the rest of my colleagues.
All right, thank you, Mike. Before I give the floor to Patrik, I will just, I saw that Aurore has a question for Patrik as well, so we'll let you comment on the current issue and take the question from Aurore at the same time. Aurore, please.
Well, thank you, Katarina. One of the obvious issues when it comes to modern warfare is the understanding of trust and the truth, and how does it exist, and how do we safeguard it? And I know, Patrik, you've written a lot about information as a pandemic, infodemic. I don't know the correct new phrase, but I'd be curious to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I'll try to blend these two things together. First, my answer to Oscar. You put this question really tricky, because the problem of being the defender is that you need to cover a lot of holes, because the attacker will find you where you're the weakest and attack you. So it's much easier to ask me if what I'm going to do with 10 billion if I'm going to attack someone. And that is really the big headache of democracies. And that leads me into your question, Aurora. And that is that I think the most troubling thing I see, at least, is that we are losing right now in the Western democracies the idea of a rational society built on truth, built on facts, built on open debate. And we're also losing this together with trust. We have seen our societies being more partisan. We have seen the political climate in US lead up to the election 2016, and I believe that the campaign into 2020 now will be very dirty. And I'm really worried about what it's doing with us as democracies, and also the bond of democracies, and how this will affect the multilateral structures in the world and the trust between nations. And of course, we have seen all this coming to a very stressful level during the corona pandemic. And also during this pandemic, we have seen in a larger scale how China and Russia been acting on the information arena in order to havoc our societies even more. And what is new during this time frame is that we could see that there is a symbiotic relationship between Chinese and Russian information operations, that they are enhancing each other in order to get more effect and more spread. And perhaps the next step will be that we will have to deal with coordination between Russia and China, even if we are not at that level that I'm ready to call out that it's happening right now, but that will be the next step. And this makes this decade ahead very troubling. So that is my biggest headache. And if I should point out an area that we need to be much better, is to create information system that safeguards the democratic values and to able to protect our democratic debate from malign influence. That technology is such a good tool in undermining the debate. And now with the development with artificial intelligence, big data, etc., the possibility to create messages to convince you in order to move you to a certain position is really frightening. But the concept of democracy that we learned during the last century. So that is I would call the biggest headache that we have in general in our society.
Thank you, Patrik. And we're starting to round up this very broad event with participants from all over the world. And I will give the floor to Gunnar for reflection and question and comments, and also some final reflections to Oscar.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, Oscar mentioned the classical mistake that we phrase as generals planning for the last war. That we are living in a belief that things are as they were. On the other hand, there is always another risk, and that is that we tend to think that everything is new, and thereby forgetting the obvious, the main threats. We are looking at the things that we are astonished about, and tend to forget that the main bulk of threats are more or less the same. I mean, a lot of people are talking about that the coronavirus is and the pandemic is a typical consequence of globalization, forgetting that we had the plague, we had the Spanish flu, and a number of other pandemics long before we used the word globalization. Industrialization was once upon a time seen as a threat, with mystical horrors coming. But on the other hand, when industrialization spread, it spread also wealth and prosperity. And disinformation is not a new thing. I mean, lying is very old. So is propaganda and disinformation. It would be interesting to test your human intelligence, not only the artificial one. The human intelligence, if you can try to frame what is really new in 30 seconds. That's an intelligence test. But also, would you like to say in 15 seconds, in this warfare that is going on just now in the gray zone, who is winning? And what should we do in order to make the others not win?
Thank you, Gunnar. And those are the final questions I will ask you to ponder upon for no more than 45 seconds. And the first question, the word goes to Oscar for a reflection also.
Well, thank you very much, Gunnar. I obviously have the answers to that. I'll just start with a short note. I think one of the key changes that is really new is the changing media landscape, which I touch upon in my chapter. I mean, we had mostly large centralized media producers before the ICT revolution, whereas today Basically, anyone can be a publisher. You still need some preconditions to reach out with your message, but that's one thing that I would highlight. No, what I want to say as well is I think my thoughts on the questions I asked are quite similar to what Leo and Michael said. I think that what we're losing is a lot, I mean, on the human side and the strategy side, not as much, you know, we're not technologically inferior or monetarily inferior. And I do give quite a lot of talks to practitioners all across Europe, in the US, and very often people come up to me afterwards and say, it's so good with these young guys who know all this new stuff, because, you know, maybe I mentioned Instagram or TikTok or things that, you know, people have no idea about. But then I always say, well, it's so nice with you old guys because you know deterrence and you know strategy, or at least you should have studied it. So I think what I want to say about the book is that this comes from the need of putting those together. I mean, you know, strategy has been studied for you know, yeah, I don't want to put a date on it, but for centuries and millennia. But a lot of things are changing. I think this really needs to be looked in parallel to not end up where Gunnar said, where everything is new, but rather, you know, war is still the battle of wills. Even if US is trying to throw money in all their problems, they still need to think about how it influences the adversary's will. So I think that's my final remarks. The book will be available online in a couple of days, and we'll send it out. And then I don't know who want to jump on Gunnar's question.
Happy to.
Please.
I think it's a very interesting question, and as our famous Sherlock Holmes said, nothing is new under the sun. But what is fundamentally new is that we have potentially depleted and destroyed our most valuable asset, our planet. And that changes everything.
Thank you, Aurore, for that very precise and short answer. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question. On the gray zone competition, who's winning? Well, I'll put it this way. Nobody is. In indirect warfare, typically nobody's winning. Usually everybody's losing. The question is who's losing more? And on that end, the West is losing more simply because intellectually it's defending much more. Russia and China have infinitely less to defend. They don't believe in a liberal international order. They don't need a giant construct to give their foreign policy coherency like the United States and the British Empire did. Okay? They don't believe a number of things that we're intellectually trying to defend beyond our countries, right? They just aren't. And if you're defending a lot more, you're just likely to lose a lot more. The reality, the effort's much harder for you, okay? And then, so no, they're not winning by much, just we're losing by more, right? That's the reality. I think that's a fair and honest answer. On what's new that is interesting, cyber warfare as a domain and cyber in general is kind of novel and interesting. Certain rules don't apply, particularly from a deterrence theory field. It's a bit more like quantum as to regular physics. And that's fun, we're exploring it. It's novel and we don't have a lot of cases of interactions there yet, but we're building them. Second one, nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons were new 70 years ago and they still are because everybody forgot what they are and what to do with them. And there's almost no nuclear strategies left. They all died. They became cyberologists, sinologists. I don't know what happened to them, okay? But they are new to everybody in the year 2020, just like they were in 1945. So, and they were revolutionary when they came out. The entire deterrence field in many ways spawned because of nuclear weapons and the advent of nuclear weapons. And so I have good news, is that due to the fact, you know, like the Dark Ages came after the Roman Empire and Europeans forgot a great deal of technology that Romans had, and then they had to rediscover it back towards the Middle Ages and say, oh, people used to build these bridges and roads and they say tremendous engineering. So in some ways, certain things are new to us because we lost a class and category of people that used to think hard about them or were familiar with them during time period. And so they remain new, even though they're pretty old. They're new to the people dealing with that problem at this time. I wanted to just make a couple cogent points. I'm sure there's other good valid comments to be made there.
Thanks, Mike. Speaking of nuclear, Leo, do you have any final comments, thoughts? Leo? There you go.
Okay. Once again, very quickly, very good question, Gunnar, as always. I would say with regard to what's kind of new in terms of military, that's qualitatively new is the speed at which technologies push people to make decisions or compress the time that's available for decisions, and you combine that with the number of international actors that can have, even though they may be relatively small countries or not as wealthy as other countries, what they do can have strategic consequences. So the speed and the number of players makes it difficult for kind of established decision-making processes, for example, in the US national security field, to understand the situation and make the appropriate response. With regard to who's winning in the gray zone, it's hard to say, but personally, I do sense, and from what I've been told by European colleagues that I stay in touch with, there certainly has been, unfortunately, in my view, an erosion of US soft power. I've spent my career, I'm 72 now, but I spent my career as a military officer, congressional staffer, and for over 30 years as a civil servant in the US bureaucracy, focusing on hard security matters. Personally, I think it's that soft power, the power of US, the example, the aspirations, the principles that's really, and certainly our alliances that have been at the bulwark or at the foundation of US strength in the world. It's those soft power things that are so important. And I don't know if we're winning or losing. I don't think we're winning. Thank you.
Thank you. And Patrik, your answer to these final questions.
The new thing is that it's everything. That means that we are in a perfect storm. So you could add everything that has been said and a lot of more issues like refugees, climate change, etc., 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 together with an incredible speed, technology, powers like Russia and China claims more influence international, etc., etc., etc. So we are heading into a perfect storm. That's the new thing, that we will have a lot of things to deal with on the same time. And currently, we are definitely not winning.
Thank you, Patrik. I think we managed to have a fairly cohesive discussion from all these chapters, and that sort of touch upon the issues of modern warfare and of conflict today and future conflict, and of all the different aspects that are involved in it. And like you said, Patrik, here at least, the new thing right now is that we have to focus on all of them at the same time. I would like to thank all of you for participating, all our 5 panelists, depending on how you count them. As Oscar mentioned, also the book will come out. It's in the press right now, or it's at the it's being printed right now. So it will be online in a few days, and also it will be possible to order a print copy. And with that, I would like to thank all of you and everyone who's been watching as well. So thank you, and welcome back to Free World Connect.